This morning, we're going to conclude a series called Leadership Pain. I'm taking a look at the life of Old Testament character, judge, by the name of Samson. And I want to remind you just a couple of things. You can take notes, follow along. There should be some cards in the rack in front of you. And I invite you to grab one of those and kind of follow along this morning. In 2007, some of you might remember this, there was a bridge over Interstate 35 that crossed the Mississippi River in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and it collapsed suddenly. And it was actually during rush hour, and unfortunately there were 13 folks who died, and it injured another 145. And what happened was an investigation revealed that the gusset plates that connect the girders together in the truss system, they were undersized. And that was a structural flaw that led to that collapse. And a year after that tragedy, a New York Times summarized exactly what went wrong. They said the designers had specified a metal plate that was too thin to serve as a junction for several girders. And that's what the investigator said. And the bridge, which was designed in the 1960s, it lasted for 40 years. But like most other bridges, it gradually kind of gained weight during that period as workers installed concrete structures to separate eastbound and westbound lanes and made other changes that added stress to that weak spot. And to say it another way, the bridge lacked integrity. The bridge has integrity when it does what it's designed to do. Cars, trains, people, they can travel across the bridge without it collapsing. And in this sense, integrity, without thinking about it too much, integrity really isn't about morality in the case of this bridge, but it's actually about the ability to function according to its intended design, the way it was purposed to work. It's really fascinating and frightening that one remarkable engineering feat can be marred by one minor flaw. Here's the key. I'll say this again. Whenever you will lead people, lead others, it's going to produce growth, it's going to produce change. And that change, it's going to lead to loss. It will lead to pain. And like the author that I've been talking about over these last few weeks, his name is Samson, like he said, growth equals pain. Friends, leadership, leading others, is pain. And over the last number of weeks, we've looked at the lives of Jacob, the Apostle Paul, Queen Esther. And the last example from this Leadership Pain series that I want to talk about is that of the final Old Testament judge of the nation of Israel, Samson. Samson had an incredible gift, but his story is actually a cautionary tale regarding gifts that control us instead of the other way around. And that's another unique aspect of leadership pain. How do you manage those you lead, and even more importantly, what you lead them with? I want to provide some context for what we're going to jump into this morning. Because see, after the death of Joshua, in the Old Testament, book of Joshua in the Old Testament, there was this period of national disorganization for the nation of Israel. It was kind of a mess. There was tribal discord, there was defeat that came about as a result of enemies. However, the author of the book of Judges informs us that when the people cried out to the Lord, God raised up judges who saved them. It comes from Judges chapter 2, verse 16. And we're going to examine the life of the last of these incredible leaders, these judges, the life of Samson. How many of you have ever heard the name Samson? Have you heard that name before? You've heard that name? You might not have read too much about him, but we're going to take a look at that. And we're going to start with talking about how it began for Samson, how everything began. And the way it began for Samson was that Samson was chosen, Samson was set apart. And we read about Samson, the son of Manoah, in Judges chapter 13. Interestingly enough, the story of Samson is more biographical than any of the other judges in the book of Judges. It's a very detailed account that comes to us during a dark period in Israel's history. The Israelites have engaged in forbidden spiritual practices. They were ruled by foreign powers. The situation got worse. It led to the Israelites' enslavement, ultimately, by the Philistines and another group called the Ammonites. And in the few chapters that precede the coming of this judge Samson, we read this word. And again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They served the Baals and the Ashtoreths and the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites, and the gods of the Philistines. And because the Israelites forsook the Lord and no longer served him, he became angry with them. He sold them into the hands of the Philistines and the Ammonites. And into this period of deep spiritual decay and decadence, 40 years worth, comes the answered prayer of a man named Manoah. And this is what we read further. A certain man of Zorah named Manoah from the clan of the Danites had a wife who was childless, unable to give birth. The angel of the Lord appeared to her and said, "You are barren and childless, but you're going to become pregnant and give birth to a son." It's kind of interesting. We're going to be, in a few weeks, talking about an angel appearing to a young woman saying that she's going to give birth to a son. But in this case, this is someone who's barren. She's not been able to have children, and this angel comes and says, "You're going to give birth to a son." And unlike the other biblical stories, we really don't know Samson's mother's name. We don't know her name. However, we know that Samson is chosen for a very special role in the nation. His parents were given very specific instructions in Judges chapter 13, verses 4 and 5. Samson's hair is to remain uncut. He was to be a Nazarite to God from the time his mother became pregnant with him. That was the deal. Now, I want to clarify really what this whole Nazarite thing is about. Actually, this isn't the first time we read about this Nazarite vow. It actually shows up in Numbers chapter 6. And here are some of the distinguishing features of someone who is fulfilling a Nazarite vow. Number 1, no drinking of grape juice or alcohol. Number 2, no cutting of their hair. Number 3, no association with dead people, including family members. The bottom line to all of this, the bottom line is Samson's chosen by God to be his instrument for Israel's deliverance from the Philistines. And so, as I'm reading this story, I begin to think, why does this matter? What difference does this make that Samson is set apart from his birth? Well, here's the deal. Even though Samson was raised in an environment where he was set apart, destined to be different, it quickly becomes evident that something's deeply wrong. Something's amiss. And we'll see that Samson was likely immersed in the compromised culture of his day, and that compromised his leadership and even affected his character. Think of it this way. Think of it like this. There's a Christian author by the name of Skye Jethani, and he shared this really interesting story about his kindergarten-age daughter. She had a homework assignment. She was asked to identify as many logos as possible. Do you know what I mean by logo? Right? Logo. Right? Logo. Okay? So that was her assignment. Without hesitation, she listed Pizza Hut, Target, and Lego. At home, she collected logos from Disney, Jell-O, Goldfish crackers. Later, while drinking a glass of water, she proudly proclaimed, "That says IKEA." She noticed a tiny logo that was imprinted on the bottom of the glass. Jathani began to kind of reflect on that experience. He wondered if it should scare him that his 5-year-old had memorized more corporate brands than Bible verses, or even the names of relatives. He also found it concerning that no one had taught her to identify those logos. They didn't have corporate logo flashcards drills at home. Zoe had simply internalized those logos by living in a brand-saturated culture. This brand marketing has been so effective that the average 10-year-old has already memorized between 300 to 400 brands. When these children become adolescents with an average of $100 of disposable cash to spend every week, they will select from those brands to construct their own identities that they can then consume, drink, smoke, drive, play, ride, and wear. The spiritual value of shopping, that's not lost on marketers either. Douglas Adkins is the author of The Culting of Brands. When customers become true believers, he said this very bluntly: brands are the new religion. Samson undoubtedly grew up captivated by the culture he was surrounded by. And rather than focusing on the life he was actually called to live, that he was set apart from at birth. Yet he was so immersed in the culture that he lost all of his inhibition. And when Samson was destined to be the leader of Israel, it becomes very quickly evident that he is over-relying on an aspect of who he is. This one particular strength of his. Something he uses to escape trouble over and over again. And actually, it's a leadership challenge to Samson. Because it's interesting, isn't it? Samson's strength literally becomes his weakness. In Judges chapter 14 is where we get an instance of how this plays out in Samson's life. Samson went down to Timnah, and he saw there a young Philistine woman. When he returned, he said to his father and mother, "I have seen a Philistine woman in Timnah. Now get her for me as my wife." That's exactly what I did. Went back home, saw my parents, said, "Hey, I saw Ruthie. Go get her." His father and mother replied, "Isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives or among all our people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife?" But Samson said to his father, "Get her for me." Now imagine, you know that this kid's pretty strong. And he's saying, "No, get her for me. She's the right one for me." His parents did not know that this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines, for at that time they were ruling over Israel. This story here introduces us to the kind of leader that Samson will become. Not only does he defy the law of Moses by marrying someone from outside the nation of Israel, but he also becomes a reluctant and cautionary tale of leadership. As I continue to read about Samson over these last few weeks, I couldn't help but wonder if he's one of these individuals who believed that his strength made him invincible. Have you ever met those people? I'm so good at something, nobody can touch me. That's how good I am at it. He thought his strength allowed him to do whatever he desired. He could get whatever he wanted, whoever he wanted. You know what? That attitude is still pretty prevalent in our own culture, even to this day. There was an official investigation conducted by the Washington Post earlier this year, and it unveiled a disturbing pattern of police officers who were abusing minors in their custody. And many of those victims were already reporting other instances of being abused. Reporters analyzed an extensive database of police arrests nationwide and identified numerous instances where officers gained the trust of minors. They preyed on them when they were alone and threatened them to make sure they kept their mouth shut. The police in particular highlighted the case of an officer, Rodney McNair, of the New Orleans Police Department. McNair was recently sentenced to 14 years in prison for violating the civil rights of a teenage girl under his care. McNair's actions were appalling and they were predictable. He'd been investigated for misconduct 12 times in his first 12 years on the job. Even months before he assaulted this girl, he'd made inappropriate comments to her in the presence of another officer. But those comments went unreported. He also had a habit of visiting her alone at home. After McNair's pattern of inappropriate behavior was reported to his superiors, he continued to work for another week during which this assault occurred. And the child eventually sued the city for allowing McNair to remain on the job. And the child's attorney prepared for trial by disposing high-ranking police officers to determine if McNair's case had prompted them to make procedural changes in the way that they did things. And to their dismay, they discovered that the truth was disturbingly familiar. Here's the question. You are unaware of any actions taken by the New Orleans Police Department to prevent another officer, McNair? The attorney asked. Correct, the police officer replied. And experts argue that a significant part of the problem lies in the limited nature of police background checks, which often fail to investigate red flags or allegations of impropriety. The strengths that any of us may have can absolutely become liabilities, especially when we insist that somehow, anyhow, we are above accountability. For instance, in this continuing story with Samson, he tries to engage in trickery with the sworn enemies of Israel, the Philistines, and it doesn't go well at all. It ends horribly. And we pick up this continuing narrative in Judges chapter 14. This is what we read. Now, his father, Samson's father, went down to see this woman. And there Samson held a feast, as was customary for young men. When the people saw him, they chose 30 men to be his companions. Let me tell you a riddle, Samson said to them. If you can give me the answer within 7 days of the feast, I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. If you can't tell me the answer, you must give me 30 linen garments and 30 sets of clothes. Tell us your riddle, they said. Let's hear it. He replied, out of the eater, something sweet, something to eat. Out of the strong, something sweet. For 3 days, they could not give the answer. And even in this, if you read through the story, Samson's wife, this one he wants as a wife, she's actually in league. She's working with the ones who are challenged to answer the riddle. And she tricks Samson into providing the answer to the riddle, and the results are not good. Beginning in verse 18, we read these words. Before the sun set on the seventh day, just in the nick of time, the men of the town said to him, what is sweeter than honey? And what is stronger than a lion? And Samson said to them, if you'd not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. Then the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him. He went down to Ashkelon, struck down 30 of their men, stripped them of everything, and gave their clothes to the ones or to those who had explained the riddle. And burning with anger, he returned to his father's home. And Samson's wife was given to one of his companions who had attended him at the feast. Once again, we're observing Samson's strength leads to incredible pain and disaster. This is what I'm talking about. When I talk about leadership pain, it can be incredible pain. Talked about how it started. It's also critically important to recognize how it ended. Because Samson ends up being greater in death than in life. You know, it's really easy. It's really super easy to read through these passages from the book of Judges and conclude that Samson was quite simply all brawn and no brains. But it's also critical to remember these words that Pastor Bryce shared with us this morning. Do you realize this? And what more shall I say? I do not have the time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned into strength, and who became powerful in battle, routed foreign armies. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what they had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. The fact is, Samson's renown as a leader ended up being greater in death than he was in life. It's kind of this classic definition of what Pastor John Maxwell, he called it failing forward. And he shared this in a book. He said this: one of the problems people have with failure is that they're too quick to judge the various isolated instances in their lives and label them as failure. Instead, they need to keep the bigger picture in mind. And I say this and encourage you to remember that throughout these 3 chapters in the book of Judges that center on the life of the leader of the nation of Israel, Samson absolutely, unmistakably blows it over and over and over again, failure after failure. For 20 years, he is a chaotic leader. For example, he does marry someone who's not an Israelite in chapter 14. His wife is then used by the enemies of Israel, causing Samson to go berserk in chapter 14. He's responsible for the enemies of Israel murdering his estranged wife and father-in-law in chapter 15. He falls in love with a woman, Delilah, who is sent by enemies of Israel to spy on him and discover what exactly his source of strength is in chapter 16. And let me just say something here when it comes to the story of Delilah. Don't kid yourself, because I know that I've done this in the past, where I point at Delilah and say, ooh, she was a bad person. Hey, Samson gets to pick. He didn't have to end up with Delilah. Delilah's being Delilah. Don't forget, Samson's being Samson too. He lies over and over and over to his wife, whom he probably suspected of being a spy for the Philistines. He lies about the source of his strength, his Nazirite vow, and how his hair is not to be cut. Finally, Samson gives in to her incessant inquiries. He tells her she cuts his hair while he's sleeping, and the enemies of Israel defeat him. And not only do they defeat him, but they capture him and they gouge his eyes out. But it's in Samson's death that changes everything. Judges chapter 16. We read these words: now the rulers of the Philistines had assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to celebrate, saying, our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands. They thought Samson's weakness was permanent. But as is the case with many of us, they missed a much bigger picture. That God was about to use this man who was considered a failure. He'd made himself a target over and over again for the enemies of Israel. But he was also a man who cried out to be used by God in that very moment. We go back to chapter 16, but we skip to verse 25. And while they were in high spirits, they shouted, bring out Samson to entertain us. So they called Samson out of prison. And he performed for them. When they stood him among the pillars, Samson said to the servant who held his hand, put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so I may lean against them. Poor Samson. He's so weak. Now, the temple was crowded with men and women. All the rulers of the Philistines were there. And on the roof, there were about 3,000 men and women watching Samson perform. So this isn't in my notes. So get it. This is what's going on. Samson's like a performing circus animal as far as they're concerned. They're watching him do his little dance. They think he's pathetic. But the account continues. Then Samson prayed to the Lord. He said, Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. Then Samson reached toward the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood, bracing himself against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other. Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. Then he pushed with all his might. Down came the temple on the rulers and the people in it. Thus, he killed many more when he died than while he lived. So in all this talk we've engaged in over the last number of weeks about leaders and leadership pain, why does it matter? Folks, here's why it matters. We're all leaders. Every one of you sitting in this room, you're a leader of somebody, somewhere, and in some way. I believe it comes down to being committed to helping people grow, helping them change, because every one of us can do that. That's what it means to be a leader. There's a coach who specializes in helping people grow and being effective leaders. And she shared this story about how she and her husband, they needed to identify and develop some new leaders for a new church that they were going to plant. And one Sunday morning, Irene, she was a church plant leader who was in her 70s. And she set up the communion table. Karen Miller says, I noticed that she then went around to make sure everything else was in order. And people did whatever she asked them to do. Afterwards, I asked her, Irene, have you ever considered that you may have leadership gifts? Absolutely not, she said. I'm just an ordinary woman, housewife, and mother. I'm not leading. I'm just serving. And some months later, our young church, Karen said, received a visit from a Rwandan church leader. And he told the church how he dreamed of starting an orphanage and school for children whose parents had been slaughtered in the genocide. And we decided we had to help. Could we hold a banquet to raise funds? And Irene agreed to help put on the banquet. Whenever she visited a possible caterer, she somehow convinced the caterer to donate most of the food. Irene talked with the banquet hall. They gave her a deep discount. So did the tech people. No one could tell Irene no. On the banquet night, over 200 people came and enough money was raised to build the school and its first dormitory. I teased her afterwards. Karen said, Irene, that was amazing. Maybe you are a leader. She laughed, for she finally had to acknowledge the truth. Each May, Irene led the banquet again. Now we could see photos of kids who had lived on the streets and never brushed their teeth, flashing broad white smiles. Boys who had been malnourished, their arms and legs painfully thin, now ran and jumped across the courtyard on strong legs. Girls who'd come dressed in rags and showed off their neat school uniforms and barrettes. After Irene went to be with the Lord, Sunrise Orphanage named a dorm after her. Karen says, I also found out that the banquet she'd led had single-handedly covered 1/3 of the school's operating cost. Folks, when you lead, things change. Growth comes, but things change. And that change, it might lead to loss. Frequently does. And that loss leads to pain. But growth equals pain. Thus, leadership equals pain. Would you pray with me? God, may we not fear growth. May we not fear loss. May we not fear pain. God, we all have a unique role, shape, place to fill in this life where we influence someone in some way. May we always be aware of that and always step up to the challenge, even though it might hurt. It's going to cost us something. But God, we know that good will come out of it. Thank you for these stories. Jacob, Paul, God, Samson, Lord, life of Esther. Just incredible men and women from your word who knew what it was to hurt, but their influence is an eternal one. We love you and we thank you. We pray all of this in the name of Jesus. Amen.